Officer Rick thought he was simply doing his duty when he spotted a young black woman behind the wheel of a luxury car. He made assumptions, jumped to conclusions, and soon found himself crossing a line he'd never intended to cross. But just 3 minutes later, as the situation spiraled beyond his control, he realized he had made a huge mistake. This time, the consequences wouldn't be so easy to escape. Before we dive into this gripping story of mistaken judgment, shifting perspectives, and a surprising twist of fate, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to hear more powerful stories like this. Sierra Carter was just 18 years old, full of hope and excitement as she drove her father's sleek black luxury car through the tree-lined streets of a wealthy suburb. It was a beautiful day, the sun glinting off the polished surface of the car as it glided down the road. Sierra's heart swelled with pride as she thought about her acceptance letter to her dream college. She had worked so hard for this moment, pouring countless hours into studying, volunteering, and balancing a part-time job. Finally, she whispered to herself, her fingers tapping the steering wheel in time to the beat of her favorite song. Her dark curls bounced as she swayed to the rhythm, her smile wide and carefree. The world seemed to open up in front of her, full of endless possibilities and dreams. Her father, Commander Matthew Jackson, had been the one to insist she take the car out for a spin to celebrate her big news. It was his way of showing how proud he was of her accomplishments. Sierra could almost hear his voice, filled with pride, saying, "That's my girl. You've earned this." She imagined herself on campus, surrounded by new friends and opportunities, feeling like she could achieve anything. This moment, driving her dad's prized possession through the picturesque neighborhood, felt like the perfect start to a new chapter. The car felt like a reward, a testament to all the challenges she had overcome. Growing up, Sierra knew what it meant to work hard, to fight for every opportunity. Her father's stories about his own struggles as a young police officer had inspired her to dream big, to believe that she could shape her own destiny. Now, as she navigated the winding streets, she felt a deep connection to those dreams, a sense that she was finally stepping into the future she had always imagined. But as Sierra turned onto a quieter street, lost in her thoughts of the future, she didn't notice the police cruiser that had pulled up behind her. Its lights flashed suddenly, startling Sierra out of her daydream. Her heart skipped a beat as she glanced in the rearview mirror, catching sight of the patrol car closing in. Confused, she quickly checked her speed. She hadn't done anything wrong, had she? Carefully, she pulled over to the side of the road, her pulse quickening as she tried to steady her breathing. Sierra's hands tightened on the steering wheel, a knot of anxiety forming in her chest. Her mind raced through the stories she'd seen on the news, stories of simple traffic stops that turned into something far worse. But she pushed those thoughts aside, telling herself that this was just a misunderstanding, that everything would be fine if she stayed calm and followed the officer's instructions. What had been a perfect day was about to take a turn she never could have imagined. As Officer Rick approached her car with a stern expression and a hand resting on his belt, Sierra's mind raced with questions. What could he possibly think she had done? Why would he single her out like this? Little did she know, this encounter would set off a chain of events that would challenge everything they both thought they knew about justice, fairness, and the true meaning of serving and protecting. And what happens next? Well, let's just say that it turns out differently than Officer Rick could have ever expected. As Sierra continued down the tree-lined street, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. But that peace shattered when she noticed flashing blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped, and she quickly pulled over, confusion clouding her thoughts. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, so why was she being stopped? The patrol car parked behind her, and a tall, stocky officer stepped out, his demeanor rigid and intimidating. This was Officer Rick, a cop with a reputation for being hard-nosed and uncompromising. He adjusted his belt, where his hand hovered near his taser, a subtle but clear signal of authority. Sierra took a deep breath, trying to keep her nerves in check. She lowered the window, her hands visibly resting on the steering wheel, just as her father had taught her. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice polite, but tinged with uncertainty. Rick peered into the car, his eyes narrowing as they swept over the luxurious interior and then back to Sierra. "License and registration," he snapped, his tone devoid of any pleasantry. Sierra furrowed her brow but complied, reaching into her glove compartment to retrieve the documents. "Here you go, sir," she said, handing them over. She offered a small, nervous smile, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Is there something wrong?" Rick barely glanced at the papers before he scoffed, his face twisted with suspicion. "This car's registered to a Commander Jackson," he said, his voice thick with skepticism. "Care to explain how you're driving it?" Sierra's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, sir. Commander Jackson is my father. He lent me the car to celebrate my acceptance into college. You can call him if you need to verify." But Rick was already shaking his head, his expression turning into a sneer. "Yeah, right. Step out of the vehicle, miss. Now." Sierra's pulse quickened, and a knot of fear tightened in her chest. "Officer, please," she tried again, her voice trembling. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can call my father. He'll confirm everything." But Rick's face remained impassive, his mind already made up. "Step out of the car," he repeated, more forcefully this time. With her hands trembling, Sierra unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. She stepped out, feeling the weight of Rick's cold stare. Her mind raced, wondering how this day had taken such a terrifying turn. Rick circled the car, his fingers tapping against the handle of his taser. To him, the expensive vehicle, combined with Sierra's youthful appearance, was all the evidence he needed to assume guilt. He stopped in front of her, his face mere inches away. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," he ordered. Sierra's breath hitched as tears pricked her eyes. She had always respected the police, believed that they were there to protect people like her. But now, standing alone on this empty street, she felt small, powerless, and utterly alone. "Sir, I promise, this is all a misunderstanding," she whispered, but her words fell on deaf ears. Rick's grip on her arm was rough as he spun her around and pushed her hands onto the warm metal of the car's hood. The next sound she heard was the click of handcuffs locking around her wrists, a cold, unyielding reminder of her sudden fall from joy to fear. The cuffs bit into her skin, and she bit down on her lip, struggling to hold back her tears. Rick guided her towards his patrol car, ignoring her protests. "Dispatch, this is Officer Rick. I need backup for a possible stolen vehicle. Young female suspect, attempting to flee the scene." Sierra's eyes widened in disbelief. "Attempting to flee?" she echoed, her voice breaking. "I didn't run. I did everything you asked." But Rick ignored her protests, focusing instead on his own narrative. To him, she was just another suspect, guilty until proven innocent. As Rick shoved her into the back seat of the patrol car, Sierra caught sight of the tow truck arriving. The driver quickly began hooking up her father's cherished vehicle to haul it away. Desperation bubbled up inside her, and she pressed her face against the glass, shouting through the crack in the window. "No! Please, that's my father's car! Don't take it!" But her pleas were drowned out by the roar of the truck's engine. She watched helplessly as the car was lifted off the ground, feeling as if her whole world was being pulled away with it. The reality of her situation hit her like a tidal wave. She was no longer the proud girl driving her father's car to celebrate a bright future. She was a suspect in the back of a police car, facing accusations she never could have imagined. Sierra sat in the back of the patrol car, her mind racing, her wrists aching from the tightness of the handcuffs. Desperation took hold as she fished out her phone from her pocket with trembling fingers, managing to dial her father's number. It rang twice before she heard his familiar voice. "Sierra, what's wrong?" Commander Matthew Jackson's tone was laced with concern, a father's intuition sensing trouble even before she spoke. "Dad, I need your help," she choked out, her voice breaking. "I'm at West Elm Drive. They think I stole your car. Please, come quickly." Jackson's response was immediate and filled with urgency. "Stay calm, sweetheart. I'm on my way. I'll be there in just a few minutes." Sierra hung up, her hands still shaking as she clutched the phone to her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the fear was overwhelming. Her father's voice had given her a sliver of hope, but she couldn't ignore the humiliating reality of being treated like a criminal. Meanwhile, Officer Rick was busy on his radio, detailing the situation to dispatch as if he had made a major bust. He spoke with a sense of self-satisfaction, completely unaware of the gravity of his mistake. To him, Sierra was just another suspect caught in the act, another mark in his record. "Dispatch, I've got the suspect detained. The vehicle is being impounded as we speak." As he turned back to the patrol car, his smug grin faded when he saw a sleek black SUV screech to a halt nearby. The door flew open and out stepped Commander Matthew Jackson, his face a storm of controlled fury. He moved with the authority of a man used to command, yet his eyes were filled with the desperation of a father. "Sierra!" he called out, his voice breaking with emotion as he rushed toward the patrol car. Sierra pressed her face against the window, tears streaking her cheeks as relief washed over her at the sight of her father. She had never been so glad to see him. Rick stepped forward, raising a hand to stop Jackson. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is a police matter," he said, his tone dismissive, not yet recognizing the man before him. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he turned his gaze on Rick, the air around him practically crackling with restrained anger. "I am Commander Matthew Jackson," he said, enunciating each word with icy precision. "And you have my daughter in handcuffs. I suggest you release her immediately." Rick's eyes went wide as the realization hit him like a cold wave. His mouth fell open and he took a step back, the color draining from his face. Commander Jackson, I didn't realize," he stammered, but Jackson cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You didn't realize because you didn't listen," Jackson snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "My daughter told you who she was. She gave you every chance to verify her story, but you assumed she was a thief because of the color of her skin. Isn't that right, officer?" Rick's mouth worked soundlessly, the arrogance that had bolstered him moments ago evaporating under Jackson's glare. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as he moved to unlock Sierra's handcuffs. Commander Jackson's gaze softened as he knelt beside his daughter, gently lifting her hands to examine her wrists. "Are you okay, Sierra?" he asked, his voice low, barely controlled as he checked for any sign of injury. Sierra nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm okay, Dad. Just scared." Jackson's jaw clenched, his anger barely held in check. He turned back to Rick, his expression hardening again. "You'll be hearing from me, officer. Believe me, this isn't over." As Rick stepped back, his earlier bravado completely shattered, Jackson helped Sierra to her feet, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. The weight of what he had almost lost hit him hard as he looked into his daughter's tear-streaked face. "It's okay, baby girl. I'm here now." The crowd that had gathered during the commotion watched in hushed silence, their faces reflecting a mix of sympathy and outrage. Some of them had recorded the incident on their phones, the footage already being shared online. Rick glanced around, seeing the phones aimed at him, and realized with dawning horror that his actions would have consequences far beyond this moment. Sierra's father turned back to face the crowd, his voice ringing out with authority. "My daughter is innocent, and I will make sure that everyone knows what happened here today. This kind of treatment has no place in our community." Rick took a step forward, his face pale. "Commander Jackson, sir, he began. But Jackson held up a hand, silencing him. "Not another word, officer," Jackson said, his tone brooking no argument. "You'll have plenty of time to explain yourself to the internal affairs investigation that will follow." Rick swallowed hard, the reality of his situation crashing down on him like a wave. He glanced at Sierra, who stood silently beside her father, her head held high despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. For the first time, he truly saw the pain and fear in her eyes, and a cold knot of shame formed in the pit of his stomach. As the tow truck driver, oblivious to the unfolding drama, finished securing the car, Jackson turned and pointed. "Unhook the car," he ordered. "This vehicle isn't going anywhere." The driver hesitated, looking between Jackson and Rick, but ultimately decided to follow the commands of the higher-ranking officer. He began to lower the car back onto the street, the mechanical whirring cutting through the tense silence. Jackson gave Sierra's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Let's get you home, Sierra," he said, his voice softening. "This nightmare is over." As they walked toward his SUV, leaving behind the scene of her humiliation, Sierra leaned into her father's side, grateful for his presence and his strength. But she knew that while this part of the ordeal was ending, the real reckoning was just beginning. For Officer Rick, for the police department, and for their community. The following morning, the sun rose over a city buzzing with whispers of what had transpired the day before. Commander Jackson's phone buzzed with notifications, emails, text messages, and missed calls from city officials, colleagues, and concerned community members. But the most pressing message came from the mayor's office. A video of Sierra's arrest had gone viral, and they needed to address the fallout immediately. As Jackson walked into the police station, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He headed straight to his office, where Officer Rick was already waiting, his face pale and drawn. The once confident officer now looked like a shadow of himself, clearly aware of how much trouble he was in. "Commander Jackson, I don't know what to say," Rick stammered as Jackson closed the door behind them. Jackson looked at Rick for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to say anything right now, officer. What you need to do is listen," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "A video of what happened yesterday is circulating online, and the public is demanding answers." Rick's face blanched even further, and he swallowed hard. "The video, I didn't realize," he began, but Jackson held up a hand to silence him. "This isn't about you anymore, Rick," Jackson said sharply. "This is about the integrity of this department and the trust of the community we serve. The mayor is holding a press conference in 2 hours, and we're going to address this head-on." Rick nodded stiffly, his hands clenching and unclenching as he processed the gravity of the situation. He had expected discipline, even suspension, but a public reckoning? The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. As Jackson prepared to leave for the press conference, he paused, turning back to Rick. "I'm giving you a chance to make this right, Rick. he said, his voice softening slightly. "If you're truly sorry, if you want to be part of the change, you'll stand beside me today. Acknowledge your mistakes publicly and show the community that you're willing to learn from them." Rick looked at Jackson, his eyes wide with surprise. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he nodded slowly, the realization of what was being asked of him settling in. Jackson offered a brief nod in return before turning to leave. Outside, the police station buzzed with a tense energy. Reporters had already gathered, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every word. Jackson took a deep breath, steeling himself for the difficult task ahead. He stepped up to the podium, the weight of the city's scrutiny pressing down on him, but his resolve was unwavering. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear and steady. "I stand before you today to address a serious incident involving one of our officers and my daughter, Sierra Carter." The reporters leaned in, eager for details. Jackson continued, his tone growing more impassioned. "Yesterday, Sierra was wrongfully detained and treated like a criminal based on an assumption that had no basis other than the color of her skin." The cameras clicked, capturing the emotion in Jackson's face. This was wrong. It was a failure on the part of our department, and as a father, it's a failure that hit home in the most painful way possible. The crowd murmured, some reporters exchanging glances as Jackson's honesty took them by surprise. But Jackson wasn't finished. "I want to make it clear that we are not here to cover up mistakes or shift blame," he continued, glancing over at Officer Rick, who stood to the side, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. "We are here to take responsibility, to learn, and to do better." Jackson paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "Officer Rick Thompson has agreed to join me today, and he has something he'd like to say." All eyes turned to Rick as he stepped up to the microphone, his hands trembling. He took a shaky breath, his voice barely more than a whisper at first. "I made a terrible mistake yesterday," Rick began, his voice cracking. "I judged Sierra without giving her a chance to explain herself, and I let my biases dictate my actions." He glanced over at Sierra, who stood with her mother at the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Rick's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I'm sorry, Sierra. I know my words can't undo the pain I caused, but I want you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken emotions. Jackson stepped forward again, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder. "We are committed to making changes in this department," he said, addressing the crowd once more. "This incident has shown us that we have a lot of work to do, and it starts with acknowledging our failures and working to be better." He outlined a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training for all officers, a community oversight board, and increased transparency in police practices. As he spoke, the crowd's initial skepticism seemed to give way to a cautious optimism. Jackson's message was clear. This was not just about one officer's mistake, but about a systemic change that would benefit the entire community. As the press conference drew to a close, Jackson took a moment to address the reporters directly. "I know that trust is not something that can be rebuilt overnight," he said, his voice tinged with emotion. "But I promise you this, under my leadership, we will earn that trust back, one step at a time." The reporters, who had come expecting a defensive stance, found themselves nodding along, recognizing the sincerity in Jackson's words. The press conference ended not with shouts or protests, but with a sense of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change for the better. As the crowd began to disperse, Jackson caught Sierra's eye, offering her a small, reassuring smile. She nodded back, her expression softened, as if to say that she believed in him, believed in the change he was trying to create. Rick, standing off to the side, took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his actions settling on him. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could become the kind of officer and the kind of person who truly made a difference. The days following the press conference were filled with tension, but also a sense of cautious optimism. Within the walls of the police station, the atmosphere was different, charged with the weight of reflection and the promise of change. Officers whispered among themselves, their usual routines disrupted by discussions about bias training, community trust, and the reforms that Commander Jackson had announced. Officer Rick found himself at the center of it all. Where he had once been confident in his authority, now he grappled with doubt and self-reflection. Jackson had given him a chance to atone for his mistakes, but the path forward was far from clear. One morning, Rick arrived at the station earlier than usual, his mind still reeling from the events of the past few days. As he walked through the hallway, he paused in front of a new poster that had been put up on the bulletin board. Bias training, building trust through understanding. The words seemed to jump out at him, a reminder of how much he had yet to learn. Taking a deep breath, Rick headed into the training room. A small group of officers had already gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. Rick took a seat near the front, his notebook open, determined to absorb every word. The instructor, a woman named Tanya, with years of experience in community relations, began with a simple yet powerful statement. We all have biases, whether we recognize them or not. Our goal here is to identify those biases and learn how to challenge them. Rick listened intently, his mind racing as Tanya guided them through role-playing exercises and discussions. They explored scenarios where quick judgments could lead to dangerous assumptions, and Tanya emphasized the importance of empathy and communication in de-escalating tense situations. For the first time, Rick found himself confronting the biases he had carried for years. He thought back to the day he pulled over Sierra, the assumptions he had made, the way he had dismissed her explanations without a second thought. The memory made him wince, but it also fueled his determination to change. During a break, Rick noticed Officer Maria Rodriguez, a colleague who had always been critical of his rigid approach, sitting alone in the corner of the room. Gathering his courage, he walked over and took a seat beside her. "Hey, Maria," Rick said, his voice tentative. I wanted to apologize. I know I've been difficult to work with in the past. I've made mistakes, and I'm trying to learn from them." Maria raised an eyebrow, surprised by his words, but after a moment, she nodded slowly. "I can see that, Rick, and I appreciate you saying it. We all have room to grow." The two sat in silence for a moment, a tentative sense of understanding building between them. It was a small step, but for Rick, it felt like a turning point. Outside of training, Rick threw himself into community outreach events, working alongside officers like Maria to rebuild the department's damaged reputation. They visited local schools, attended neighborhood meetings, and listened to the concerns of residents who had long felt alienated by law enforcement. One afternoon, while helping out at a community garden project, Rick found himself paired with a group of teenagers who were initially wary of his presence. But as he shared stories from his own life, mistakes he had made, lessons he had learned, their skepticism began to melt away. "I know I've got a lot to prove," Rick told them honestly, planting a row of seedlings beside a young boy named Malik. "But I'm here because I want to earn your trust, not just expect it." Malik looked up at him, curiosity in his eyes. "Do you really think people can change?" he asked, his voice skeptical, yet hopeful. Rick paused, considering the question. "I think we have to try," he said finally, "because if we don't, nothing ever will." As the days turned into weeks, Rick began to feel a shift within himself. The rigid walls he had built around his mind and heart slowly started to crumble, replaced by a newfound understanding of the people he had once viewed with suspicion. He realized that being a good officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about serving the community with compassion and humility. Commander Jackson watched these changes with a quiet sense of pride. He knew that Rick's journey was far from over, but he believed that the seeds of growth had been planted. And as the department slowly began to rebuild its relationship with the community, Jackson felt a glimmer of hope for a future where officers and residents could work together, rather than against one another. Sierra, too, noticed the shift when she encountered Rick at a community event. She saw a man who was trying, really trying, to make amends. And while she wasn't ready to fully forgive him yet, she could see the effort he was putting in, and that meant something. For the first time since that fateful day, Sierra allowed herself to believe that change was possible. Not just for Rick, but for the entire community. And as she watched her father and Rick shake hands after another long day of outreach, she realized that maybe, just maybe, the future held a promise of something better. A few weeks later, Sierra found herself standing outside the police station, her hands stuffed into the pockets of her jacket. She had been invited to speak at a community forum about her experience, but part of her still felt hesitant. Though she had seen signs of change in the department and in Officer Rick, the memory of that day was still raw. Commander Jackson stepped outside, his gaze warm but serious as he looked at his daughter. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Sierra?" he asked gently. Sierra took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. "I think I am, Dad," she replied, her voice steady. "If I'm going to help make things better, I have to be willing to face this head-on." Jackson nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "You're stronger than you know, sweetheart. Just remember, you don't have to do this alone." Together, they walked into the station, where a small gathering of officers and community members awaited them. Rick was there too, standing nervously to the side. He glanced up as Sierra entered, offering her a tentative nod. She returned it, acknowledging the effort he was making, even if it still felt awkward. As the forum began, Sierra stepped up to the front of the room, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the microphone. She scanned the faces around her, some sympathetic, others skeptical, and found the courage to speak her truth. "A few weeks ago, I was scared and humiliated," Sierra began, her voice clear but tinged with emotion. "I was handcuffed and treated like a criminal, all because of assumptions made about me. It's a feeling I'll never forget, and it's one that too many people like me have had to experience." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Sierra took a deep breath, her resolve growing stronger. "But I'm not here to dwell on the past," she continued. "I'm here because I believe in the possibility of change. I've seen what happens when people like my father, Commander Jackson, and Officer Rick are willing to confront their mistakes and work towards a better future." She glanced over at Rick, who shifted uncomfortably but met her gaze. "Officer Rick made a mistake that day, and it hurt me deeply. But he's also shown that he's willing to learn from it. That matters, and I think it's something we all can learn from." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Sierra's honesty had struck a chord, her willingness to acknowledge both the pain and the potential for healing resonating with those present. Rick took a step forward, his hands trembling as he reached for his own microphone. "Sierra, I just want to say thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know that what I did was wrong, and I can't undo that. But hearing you speak about forgiveness and hope, it's It's given me a chance to see things differently." He looked out at the gathered community members, many of whom had been critical of him in the weeks since the incident. "I'm not perfect, and I have a long way to go," Rick continued. "But I promise you all, I'm committed to being better, to listening, to learning, and to making sure that no one else has to go through what Sierra did." Sierra nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't a full reconciliation. There was still hurt that would take time to heal. But in that moment, she saw a glimmer of the change she had hoped for. The forum continued with other community members sharing their stories, their concerns, and their hopes for a better relationship with the police. There were tears, heated exchanges, and moments of silence where the weight of the past hung heavy in the air. But there were also moments of connection, where officers and residents found common ground and began to see each other in a new light. As the event came to a close, Sierra stepped down from the podium, her heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Rick approached her, his expression tentative but sincere. "Thank you, Sierra," he said quietly, "for giving me a chance to make things right." Sierra studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy, Officer Rick," she replied honestly. "But I believe you're trying, and that's a start." Rick shook her hand, a sense of relief washing over him. "I'll keep trying," he promised, his voice filled with determination. As Sierra and her father left the station that evening, she looked back at the building, a place that had once symbolized fear and injustice. Now, it felt like a place where healing was possible, where new beginnings could take root. And for the first time since that terrible day, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Weeks turned into months, and the changes within the police department began to ripple throughout the community. Sierra's story had sparked a conversation that could no longer be ignored, and with Commander Jackson's leadership, those conversations turned into action. The department's new focus on empathy training and community outreach was met with mixed reactions at first, but slowly, attitudes began to shift. Officer Rick found himself at the center of this change, participating in workshops and training sessions designed to challenge deeply held biases. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he felt defensive, even resentful of the scrutiny he faced. But each time, he reminded himself of Sierra's words, about the impact of his actions and the responsibility he now had to be better. One sunny Saturday, Rick joined a group of officers for a community cleanup event at a local park. He found himself working side by side with residents, including families like Sierra's. At first, the conversations were stilted, filled with awkward pauses and polite small talk. But as the day wore on, something began to shift. Rick noticed the kids from the neighborhood were warming up to him, asking about his job and what it was like to be a police officer. He found himself sharing stories about his own struggles, his efforts to be a better person. And as he listened to their stories in return, he realized that this was the connection he had been missing all along. Sierra arrived with her father later that afternoon, carrying a tray of lemonade for the volunteers. She spotted Rick helping a group of kids plant flowers and paused, watching the scene with a small smile. It was a far cry from the officer she had met that day on the side of the road, a man who now seemed genuinely invested in the well-being of the community. As Sierra approached, Rick looked up, catching her eye. He offered a tentative wave, which she returned with a nod. She walked over, handing him a cup of lemonade. "You're pretty good with kids, Officer Rick," she remarked, her tone teasing but warm. Rick chuckled, taking the cup with a grateful smile. "I'm learning," he replied. "Turns out there's a lot I didn't know about this community, about myself." Sierra nodded, her expression thoughtful. I think we're all learning, she said. It's not just about what happened between us. It's about everyone realizing that we have to see each other as people first. Rick glanced around the park, where officers and residents worked side by side, laughing and sharing stories. You're right, Sierra, he said quietly, and I'm glad I got a chance to see that. Sierra gave him a small smile before turning to help her father set up a picnic table. As she walked away, Rick couldn't help but feel a sense of hope blooming in his chest, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to make amends. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the park transformed into a gathering place for the community. Families spread out blankets, kids played tag on the grass, and a group of teenagers took over a corner with a speaker, filling the air with music. The atmosphere was light, filled with the laughter and chatter of neighbors who had come together, not as strangers, but as a community. Commander Jackson stood off to the side, watching the scene unfold with a sense of quiet pride. This was what he had envisioned when he pushed for change. Officers and residents working together, building trust one conversation at a time. Sierra joined her father, a contented smile on her face. "It's nice, isn't it?" she asked, gesturing to the lively scene before them. "Seeing everyone come together like this." Jackson nodded, his expression softening. "It is, and a lot of that is thanks to you, Sierra. You had the courage to speak out, to hold us all accountable. It's made a difference." Sierra looked up at her father, a touch of sadness still lingering in her eyes. "I just hope that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Jackson wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "That's the goal, sweetheart, and we're going to keep working toward it, every single day." As the evening wore on, Rick found himself standing near the edge of the gathering, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Sierra, her expression thoughtful as she took in the scene. "You know," she said quietly, "I never thought I'd see you here, doing all this, but I'm glad you are." Rick looked at her, gratitude filling his chest. "Thank you, Sierra, for giving me the chance to change, for believing that I could." Sierra glanced at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "Don't thank me yet, Officer Rick. We've still got a long way to go." Rick nodded, a sense of determination settling in his heart. "Yeah, we do, but I'm ready." Together, they turned back to the gathering, watching as their community shared a moment of peace, hope, and the promise of a better future. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by laughter and warmth, they both knew that change was possible, not just for them, but for everyone willing to see each other with open eyes and open hearts. As the summer drew to a close, the changes within the community continued to take root. The reforms at the police department, led by Commander Jackson, had become a model for other precincts in the city. Officers who had once viewed sensitivity training with skepticism now spoke about their experiences openly, sharing how much they had learned about themselves and the people they served. Sierra's story had reached far beyond their neighborhood. News outlets covered the police department's efforts to rebuild trust, highlighting Sierra as a symbol of resilience and hope. She had been invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even on a local news program. Each time, she shared her message of unity and the importance of seeing each other's humanity. But even with all the progress, there were still moments of doubt. Sierra found herself occasionally overwhelmed by the memories of that painful day. The humiliation, the fear, the feeling of being powerless. She wondered if the changes they were working so hard to build would truly last, or if they were just temporary fixes. One evening, Sierra sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her father joined her, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. He handed one to her and settled into the chair beside her, the creak of the old wood filling the comfortable silence between them. "Dad," Sierra began hesitantly, "do you think all this will really make a difference? Or are we just going to go back to the way things were?" Jackson took a slow sip of his tea, considering her question. "Change is hard, Sierra," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "It's not always a straight line. There will be setbacks, and there will be people who resist. But every step forward counts." Sierra nodded, resting her chin on her hand as she watched a group of kids ride their bikes down the street. "I just want to believe that things can really get better, that no one else has to go through what I did." Jackson reached out, squeezing her hand gently. "I believe they can, and I believe that you've made a difference already. Look at everything that's changed in just a few months. You've inspired so many people, including me." Sierra glanced at her father, seeing the pride in his eyes, and felt a small spark of hope rekindle in her chest. "Thanks, Dad," she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I guess we just have to keep trying, right?" Jackson smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "That's right. We keep trying. We keep pushing. And we never forget why we're doing it." Meanwhile, Officer Rick continued his journey of self-reflection and growth. He had become an active participant in the department's outreach programs, visiting schools and attending neighborhood meetings. He found that listening to the concerns of the community, truly listening, gave him a perspective he had never had before. One afternoon, Rick visited a local high school to speak with a group of students about the importance of building trust between law enforcement and the community. As he stood in front of the classroom, he felt a familiar nervousness wash over him, but he pushed through it. "Hey everyone," Rick began, clearing his throat. "I'm Officer Rick, and I'm here to talk to you about some of the changes we're making in the department. But before I do, I want to share a story with you. A story about how I messed up and what I learned from it." The students listened intently as Rick recounted the day he had pulled over Sierra, the mistakes he made, and the lessons he learned from the experience. He spoke openly about his biases, his regrets, and the journey he was still on to become a better person. "And I know it's going to take time for me to earn back the trust I lost that day," Rick said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work, and I hope that, over time, I can show you all that I've changed." As Rick finished speaking, a young student raised her hand. "Do you really think people can change, Officer Rick?" she asked, her tone skeptical but curious. Rick thought about Sierra's forgiveness, about the support from Commander Jackson, and the small moments of connection he had experienced with the community since that day. He met the student's gaze, a determined look in his eyes. "Yeah, I do," he replied. "But it's not just about wanting to change. It's about doing the hard work every single day, even when it's uncomfortable." After the talk, a few students came up to thank Rick for his honesty. He shook their hands, feeling a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to make a real difference. That evening, Sierra and Rick found themselves back at the community center for another event, a celebration of the progress their neighborhood had made. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and music, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined their interactions. Sierra stood near the entrance, chatting with her father, when she noticed Rick approaching. He looked nervous but determined, clutching a small bouquet of flowers in his hand. "Hey, Sierra," he said, offering the flowers with an awkward smile. I thought you might like these, just as a small thank you for everything you've taught me." Sierra's eyes softened as she accepted the bouquet, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "Thank you, Officer Rick. It means a lot." Rick nodded, a look of relief washing over him. "I know we've come a long way, But if there's anything more I can do, just let me know." Sierra glanced around the room, taking in the sight of her neighbors mingling with officers, the sense of community that had grown stronger with each passing day. She looked back at Rick, her expression thoughtful. "Just keep doing what you're doing," she said, "and keep listening. That's all I ask." Rick smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. "I can do that." And as they joined the crowd, both Sierra and Rick knew that while the journey wasn't over, they were moving forward, together, as part of a community that believed in the power of change. Months later, the chill of autumn filled the air as Sierra stood on the steps of her new college, looking out over the bustling campus. Students hurried past, clutching books and chatting excitedly about their classes. Sierra clutched her bag tightly, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. She felt a sense of accomplishment that filled her with warmth, even in the cool breeze. After everything that had happened, she had finally made it to her dream school. But it wasn't just the excitement of college life that lifted her spirits. It was the knowledge that she had left her community in a better place than she found it. Her story had sparked important conversations, not just in her hometown, but far beyond. Sierra had become a voice for change, a role she never expected but had grown to embrace. Sierra's phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She smiled when she saw the message from her father. "Thinking of you today, sweetheart. Proud of you always. Call me when you can. Love, Dad." She quickly typed back a response, her fingers cold against the phone screen. "Love you too, Dad. We'll call tonight." As she put her phone away, a memory of that fateful day flashed through her mind. Officer Rick's stern face, the weight of the handcuffs, the fear that had gripped her heart. But alongside those memories were the moments of change. Rick's apology, her father's unwavering support, and the way her community had come together to turn a painful experience into a catalyst for something better. Sierra took a deep breath, standing tall as she looked out at her new life. She knew that there would still be challenges ahead, moments when the past would feel close again, moments when progress seemed slow. But she also knew she wasn't alone in facing them. She had her family, her friends, and even those she once saw as adversaries, now working beside her to create a more just world. As Sierra stepped onto the campus pathway, she felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. Back in their hometown, the impact of the changes continued to ripple through the police department. The reforms that had started with Sierra's story had grown into a comprehensive program that other precincts were looking to adopt. Officer Rick, who had once been the embodiment of a broken system, had become a surprising advocate for the new approach. He often spoke at community meetings, sharing his journey of transformation with humility and honesty. He had learned to listen, to truly hear the experiences of those who had once feared him. And in doing so, he found a new purpose in his role as a police officer, not just to enforce the law, but to build trust and understanding with the people he served. One evening, after a particularly moving discussion with a group of local high schoolers, Rick found himself driving past the street where he had first pulled Sierra over. He slowed down, glancing at the spot that had once been the scene of so much tension and pain. He parked the patrol car and stepped out, the cool air brushing against his face as he stood quietly, lost in thought. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he remembered Sierra's courage that day, the way she had stood up for herself, even in the face of injustice. It was that strength, he realized, that had been the turning point for him. It had forced him to confront the flaws in his own thinking and start the long, hard journey toward becoming a better person. Rick closed his eyes for a moment, making a silent promise to continue the work he had started. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could help build a future where no one else would have to endure what Sierra had gone through. And that, he decided, was something worth fighting for. In their old neighborhood, Commander Jackson continued his mission with renewed determination. He had always believed in the potential for change, but watching Sierra's resilience and the transformation within his department had deepened that belief. He now worked closely with community leaders, ensuring that the progress they had made would not be undone. One sunny afternoon, he met with a group of young people at the community center, many of whom looked up to Sierra as a role model. They shared their own stories of hope and hardship, of wanting to be seen for who they were beyond their skin color or their background. As Jackson listened, he felt a deep sense of pride. These young people were the future of the community, and he was determined to leave them with a better world than the one he had inherited. "Remember," he told them, his voice carrying a fatherly warmth, "the work doesn't stop with one person or one moment. It's something we all have to keep at every single day. But together, we can make sure that our future is brighter than our past." The young people nodded, their faces filled with a mixture of determination and hope. Jackson felt a familiar warmth fill his chest, a feeling that had become more common as the community continued to heal. As the sun set over the town that evening, casting long shadows over the familiar streets, a sense of peace settled in the air. Sierra, Rick, and Commander Jackson had all faced their own battles, but they had come through stronger, more compassionate, and ready to build a better future. And as Sierra looked out from her dorm room window, Rick drove through the quiet streets, and Jackson wrapped up another long day of work. They each felt a sense of optimism for what lay ahead. The journey wasn't over. It never would be. But together, they had proven that even in the face of pain, change was possible. And sometimes, it just took a few brave voices to make all the difference.